Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson, the economy is in the toilet. But who put it there? And how do we fish it out without getting our hands wet? Find out in a moment. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, she is in a bit of a pickle. A quick glance at the UK economy dashboard shows, any number of warning lights flashing. The pound against the dollar, growth or lack thereof, inflation, even the cost of government borrowing. With the markets turning against this government's economic strategy, does Ms Reeves actually have any options beyond raising taxes and cutting spending? And is it really all her fault, as the opposition claims? Our economics editor, Ed Conway, is back on the Daily. I always like to start with the most depressing question first. Comparatively, how bad are things at the moment?
It's not like anything has actually dramatically changed. It's not like we've got much new data recently that said the economy is in a terrible position. There was growth figures that were downgraded not long ago. But in a way, that kind of says it all. The weird thing about what's happened in the last, the last few days is that markets have taken a turn without there being a kind of piece of news that has pushed them there, which suggests it's mood. It's vibes. It's this word that everyone uses these days.
Yes.
So we must. It's
younger
vibes.
Than us, generally.
And the vibes have gone against the UK. But they've also, it's worth saying, it's not like we are a massive outlier here. Mostly what people are talking about right now is the interest rates on government debt.
Yeah.
So it's the bond yields, as they're known. But it's essentially, it's a way of kind of measuring just how much governments have to borrow, have to pay in interest costs in the future. But the point is, it's not quite as severe and as stressful and as scary as it was after the mini-budget in 2022. But there are some of the same hallmarks happening. And like I say, it's not just the UK this is happening to. It's also happening to some extent in Europe. It's happening to some extent in the US as well. So there's part of this broader sense that the world economy isn't looking in as good as a position as it was before. Inflation might be higher. Growth might be lower. We're worried about what's going to happen with kind of Donald Trump and tariffs. But all of these things, that I think that the significant thing about the UK right now is, in this moment where everyone is thinking, I'm a bit nervous, I'm selling out on this kind of asset and I'm going to buy something much safer instead, it's quite hard to put your finger on exactly what it is. I mean, like, to some extent, it's things like Brexit. To some extent, it's Liz Truss. I mean, I think a lot of it's Liz Truss. To some extent, it's what was in the budget, and it wasn't as encouraging. But you know what I mean? It's a lot of this stuff altogether rather than just one single explanation.
Totally. But, I mean, the budget has had a pretty big knock-on effect in terms of business confidence, just in terms of where we are right now.
Yeah, the budget did not help. And actually, the run-up to the budget with all of this language about the economy being in a terrible place, an enormous black hole, and it turns out the black hole wasn't half as big as the Chancellor said. The mood music, even ahead of the budget, was starting to make people feel a bit depressed, and you were actually starting to see that impact on the economy, which was clearly, in hindsight, I think they kind of overdid that. And then the budget, well, when it came to the budget, I think a lot of people thought they knew that Rachel Reeves was going to change the fiscal rules. She was going to come up with these slightly looser rules that allowed her to borrow more money. They didn't expect her to borrow quite as much as she actually ended up borrowing. And then they looked at the details and they realised that actually a lot of this borrowing, some of the borrowing is borrowing to invest. In inverted commas, that's good borrowing. But actually, the majority of the borrowing was to finance extra pay rises for people within unions. And a lot of people have thought, well, hang on, that looks like a lot more debt, and are we getting the extra kind of value and the extra growth that we were hoping for from him?
So is this kind of like the opposite of the reaction that happened with the mini-budget with Liz Truss? They cut taxes at a rate that the markets weren't expecting. Rachel Reeves has added to the debt burden more significantly than was expected.
No, I'd say it's kind of similar, because in both cases people were expecting the government, that the UK is going to borrow more. In Liz Truss's case, it was borrowing more to cut taxes. In Rachel Reeves, it's borrowing more to finance spending. But it's still, you are facing far higher debt in the future. And the nerve-wracking thing about 2022, about that moment, was they just didn't know kind of where it was going to end. At the time of the mini-budget, what struck me was that you build up credibility over a long time. Okay, as a nation, you build up credibility.
Yeah.
And that credibility among investors ensures that your interest rate is that bit lower than it would otherwise be, because they know they're going to get their money back and they know that you're going to behave in a rational way. But that was eroded a little bit before Liz Truss came into office. But then when she came into office, that was really kind of one of those final straws. And it's not like that has been rebuilt. And if anything, people are still very nervous when they look at the UK. They're still nervous when they look at Labour. Having changed the fiscal rules to give her far more space to borrow, and having decided that she was going to spend some of that borrowing on current spending rather than investment, she left herself a very small sliver of headroom against those new, even easier fiscal rules.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about those rules. Fiscal rules, what are they and what are they currently?
So previously there was a rule that said you need to get the net debt, the national debt, as a percentage of GDP falling. Now it's a different measure of national debt called public sector net financial liabilities. You need to get that falling. I think a lot of people would have looked at that change in the rule and said it's kind of fine. I'm a bit sceptical about fiscal rules. But I have to say my scepticism about fiscal rules, because I think, what matters more than that is credibility.
That's how you provide that reassurance, by having the overall structure in place and sticking to it.
But what they've shown is that actually even fiscal rules, the existence of fiscal rules doesn't necessarily mean you're more credible. It's about kind of how you actually prosecute your fiscal policy. But the issue is, like I say, having got the extra leeway they got out of getting this slightly looser definition of national debt.
Kevin, you and I talked in the run-up to the last general election about Labour's constant mantra, growth, 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 growth. Are you surprised that there just hasn't been what they had expected?
The forecast, or the target that Keir Starmer set himself back in opposition of being the fastest growing economy in the G7, when they came up with that, we were all, people who cover economics and actually look at these numbers on a day-to-day basis, were all like, that's just bonkers. There's no way you're going to achieve that. And I at the time, I kind of wrote something along those lines.
It speaks to naivety, doesn't it?
I think it does speak to a bit of naivety, and also once you get into office, everyone wants more growth. And we've yet to see whether this government is capable of actually making stuff happen. So far, I think, one of the complaints that's happened a lot is there have been all these, investigations and consultations and inquiries, and not enough clear strategy about what kind of an economy do you want, what kind of a nation do you want. And I'm still a little bit in the dark about that.
Let's talk for a second then about that, what I think is a very fascinating trip that Rachel Reeves took, that trip to China.
Yeah.
Fascinating for two reasons. Firstly, that she went, and actually, as I understand it, no journalists went with her, just a group of bankers.
We wanted to go.
But second, the purpose of this trip and the signal, however faint it might be, that she was sending with it.
I think in a way, actually, deciding to do this trip is one of the most interesting and decisive things that this government has done. Even if I'm not sure that they necessarily view it in the same way. But all around the world, pretty much every other developed economy is going in the other direction when it comes to China.
Tariffs. They're
imposing tariffs on China. They're kind of, introducing more regulations. They're moving away from China. The UK is moving towards China. We are the only country in the world, or the only developed economy, save for Japan, which doesn't buy much in the way of Chinese cars. We're the only developed economy which hasn't imposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. America has 100% tariffs. We have 0% above the standard 10%.
They've got more car manufacturing in the United States.
Yeah, they do. And frankly, they import very few Chinese cars at the moment. But even so, we're at this inflection point right now. A lot of countries around the world, they're looking at their manufacturing sector, okay? And they're looking at it and they're saying, what is the key bit of our manufacturing sector, the bit that everything else kind of, to some extent, hinges on? And it's cars. And it has been for the last century. The linchpin of manufacturing in Europe and in the US, and to some extent in the UK, has been cars. Because if you have a place turning out steel, there will be a percentage of that steel that goes into cars. They're making chemicals. Some of that will be going into kind of plastics that go into cars. There are very few bits within manufacturing that don't get touched by the car sector just because it's so big. But that car sector is now under potentially mortal threat from the disruption that you're seeing within electric cars, within electric automation. And partly that's just because it's a different business and they're not kind of ready for it. Making engines is very different to making batteries. But partly it's because China has just taken the bull by its horns on cars and has invested in this so much earlier than everyone else. Yeah. It's very, very difficult for Europe and the US to compete full stop right now with China. The choice is to try and have a closer relationship with China. So A, we can get something in return like our financial services industry can do a bit better. And that's one bit of our economy where we do have an obvious comparative advantage. And B, so we can get cheap Chinese cars. And so, and as a result of that, C, you can meet your 2035 EV mandate of getting 100% of electric cars. It ticks a lot of boxes, but it's not without controversy.
Ed, just take a pause there. When we come back, we will be asking, what can Rachel Reeves actually do? Back in a sec. Ed Conway still in the studio with me as we wonder exactly why the economy is in such a state and what can be done about it. And we were just mentioning tariffs there, or the lack of tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. I mean, one person who seems incredibly fond of tariffs is the incoming US President Donald Trump. To what extent does the United States, Donald Trump, factor into what's going on at the moment and indeed the plans moving forward?
Look at Donald Trump's kind of broad economic platform that he was standing on. He was planning to borrow much more than Kamala Harris. So you're looking at Donald Trump and you're seeing A, more inflation potentially, you're seeing B, more borrowing, and you're thinking about the kind of global consequences of this. And so it's no surprise that the interest rate for pretty much every government around the world is going up. And you're also seeing currency markets kind of fluctuating quite a lot because, if Donald Trump does impose tariffs on, let's say, Europe or indeed anyone else, that the way that is initially felt is your currency market just responds to it, okay? Mm-hmm. And it goes up or down accordingly, depending on, where the tariffs are being imposed. So people are just starting to react to all of that. I think it's a big moment in short. Like, I really do think... I tell you what, I remember 4 years ago, I was in Davos at the time of the first Donald Trump inauguration.
That's the World Economic
Forum. The World Economic Forum. It's a place which you would have kind of called the opposite of the mindset of the kind of Make America Great Again. Mm-hmm. And they were aghast by the whole thing. He was up there on the stage saying, protection. I'm going to make America great, and we're making America great with protection. Because if you think about Davos, this place is the epicenter of globalization. It's massively controversial these days, and they have done very well, thank you very much, out of the last 50 years of globalization. And they saw Donald Trump as this terrible threat to what was happening there. They saw Donald Trump as a threat to their world, and they were hoping it would go away. And this is what I think is significant about this. It hasn't gone away. No. On the contrary, Donald Trump is back, and he's back with much more of a mandate than he had first time around. He's back with control of Congress. And he is back saying the same things that he said 8 years ago about protection, about tariffs, except he's saying them with even more conviction. And to me, that says something massively significant, which is that the nature of the globalized world, the nature of globalization has changed. And a lot of people will look at this inauguration and be like, that is a landmark moment. And it is a landmark moment. The world is changing right now in almost incalculable ways. And we, I think, are only starting to understand what that means.
Do you get the impression that Rachel Reeves understands this? I mean, genuinely, what can she do given the fiscal rules?
So Rachel Reeves has got a lot of stick in the last 6 months. Stick for things like, people accusing her of not being an economist. I have interviewed and talked to and known, every chancellor going back to Gordon Brown. And she is about the most like an economist chancellor that I can remember.
What does that mean?
It means she thinks in economic terms. It means she has that mindset of thinking in terms of supply and demand, of Ricardian equivalence, of comparative advantage, a division of labour, of all of these different principles which guide the mindset of people who work within the Bank of England, who work within the Treasury. But here's the thing. A lot of that economic orthodoxy is under challenge by people like Donald Trump. So actually, I think of all Rachel Reeves is definitely an economist. As I see it, she's an economist. But of all the moments in history where actually that might be a bit of a handicap, it's now.
In the short term, Keir Starmer is launching the government's plans to bring in artificial intelligence and make the UK the home of it. More on that in just a second. But actually at that news conference that followed his speech, he was asked directly couple of times about the problems that the economy is having right now and what is coming next, and he dodged it. When he's asked, does all this mean we are going to have to see taxes rise and public spending cut? And he dodged it.
And the way things are looking right now, it looks like they're going to have to make a compromise, and that compromise will probably be it's one of the three. Either the fiscal rules go, but if that goes, I think that would be pretty difficult, or taxes have to go up. But they're already heading to the highest, tax burden that we have had in our history, in the existence of this nation. So is that sustainable? I don't, we might be getting to that point, in which case it's kind of question of spending. But what are you going to cut? And it's really invidious for this government.
I mean, Keir Starmer seems to think that artificial intelligence could help turn around the economy. I just think your thoughts on that. I mean, there was an awful line used. Today's plan mainlines AI into the veins of this enterprising nation. What do you make of the AI strategy?
AI is so much in vogue at the moment. It could be absolutely massive. It'll have a massive bearing on what we're doing and services. It'll have a massive bearing on the fact that 80% of this economy, the vast majority of you listening, work within the services sector. And AI could disrupt a lot of that. We're not bad on AI. In the UK, we've got a few interesting kind of companies. But it is interesting, again, the US is the massive leader on this. The challenges are, that the UK has, it's hard to plan and to build stuff. It's hard to we don't have a grid that's kind of up to scratch for the renewable world that we want in the future. And the prices of all this stuff is too high. AI is affected by all of that as well. It's not just about brain power. It's about the kind of, physical stuff too.
Ed, just in terms of where the UK economy is right now, we've had some fascinating interventions in politics over the past 7 days, but none perhaps more amusing than the former Prime Minister Liz Truss sending the current Prime Minister Keir Starmer a cease and desist letter asking him to stop blaming her for crashing the economy. Look, the Conservatives are accusing Rachel Reeves of essentially of the same thing right now. I mean, is either side right? Did Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng ruin the economy? Has Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer stuffed the UK?
It's so difficult because you just get sued, don't you? If you start...
Why do you think I asked you the question and offered no opinion?
I don't think Liz Truss improved the economy.
No.
But she didn't have long enough to make any difference to the economy. She did nothing to the economy, but she did, to financial services and the markets. That did not help. It wasn't just her either. I mean, again, let's not do the whole kind of post-mortem. We've done it. We've talked about it enough.
Yeah.
But because there was lots going on, Bank of England wasn't doing a brilliant job at that point as well. We lost a lot of our credibility in financial markets. We'd always been seen as a very safe place to put your money.
Sure, but similarly, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer came into Downing Street with a huge amount of goodwill from the business community, which they in essence tore up out of the blue for many, many people, changes to national insurance.
I think it's been a great start, and I think this latest episode speaks to that. That's markets saying we are not especially convinced by your policy, and we need to see more clarity. And we all need to see more clarity. We all want to know what this government really, really stands for, but we don't know quite what kind of a country they want at the end of those 5 years, and they need more articulation of that and more action.
Ed Conway, always good to see you. Thanks for being with us. And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. To read more of Ed's analysis, simply head to skynews.com. We'll catch you again tomorrow.